Please hold. Hello, everybody. Hello. Hello. Welcome to the People's Forum. Can I get a show of hands of people who have been here before? Wow, amazing. I'm actually happy to see that that is not the majority of faces. Thank you so much. For those who've been here before, welcome back. If you're a new face, welcome to the People's Forum. We are a political and popular education space dedicated to uniting working class forces here in the US and abroad. And having regular book talks is indeed an essential part of our political education programming. So we have partnered with Verso and Jacobin for a number of different important events. I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Mia. I'm the current research assistant here at the People's Forum. And I wanted to share with all of you, as we do with most of our events, that we are having our 5th anniversary actually this September. And so we invite all of you as attendees of this event to join us. We're going to have a celebration on the day of, and we're doing an immensely important fundraiser for that. So if you appreciate this event, if you have a great time tonight, if you want to see more of these events here in New York City, then I encourage you to contribute to our fundraiser in physical form or in digital form, either later today or in the future. So thank you all so much for coming. I'm so excited for this book talk, Quick Fixes, an essential history, one that is super prescient for today, addresses the realities of a lot of the working class here in the United States. And so with that, I will pass it off directly to our panelists to introduce themselves and get started.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks to the People's Forum for hosting. Just a few other thank yous before I get started. Thanks to Asher, Michelle, who I haven't met yet. I don't know if you're here or not. Thanks also to Chris, Anthony, everyone at Verso and Jacobin for helping make this book a reality. It's been a long time coming. It's very exciting that it's finally out there. Thanks also to Emily and Christian for being here to be discussants. Emily Dufton hosts the New Books in Drugs, Addiction, and Recovery program on the New Books Network. It's a great podcast. I listen to a lot of them as part of research for this book. You should definitely check it out. Also, the author of a great history of marijuana reform movements called Grassroots, both pro and anti. So thanks so much for being here. And thanks also to Christian Parenti for being here. I was just saying before this, I feel like I've been reading your writing for most of my adult life. So it's really an honor to have you here. A very truthful and honest voice on the left, and very, honored for you to be here. All right. So just so everyone knows what we're doing tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about the basic structure of the book, just a sort of top-line summary. And then we're going to talk about a basic question that is central to the book, which is simply this: why us? Like, why the United States? Why do we so love consuming drugs and also so vilifying them? So we'll each answer that question for a few minutes. We'll discuss and then open it up for Q&A. All right, the top line summary. So in short, we're in the midst of a world historic drug binge. Americans, we comprise, between 4 and 5% of the world's population. We consume 80% of its opioids. We consume a bit more than 80% of its amphetamine drugs, its ADHD medications. And in the 21st century, basically every metric of drug consumption is through the roof. So, I think the most familiar part of this is the opioid crisis and associated deaths of despair. But really, you name it, marijuana, benzodiazepines, amphetamines, antidepressants, antipsychotics, all are at historic highs in terms of their usage, and all are going up in their usage. At the same time, the U.S. is the home to the largest prison system in the world. A full 1/5 of prisoners are in there for nonviolent drug offenses. So this is a massive paradox at the heart of American society. We have this unique and really intense love-hate affair with drugs. And while it's particularly acute as of late, I think we've kind of been that way for well over a century. If you just think casually about the history of psychoactive drugs, just sort of the key reference points, they all are kind of centered in the US. So it's Americans that drove the cocaine boom in the 80s. It's the American counterculture that's most associated with psychedelics in the 60s. In the post-war period, benzodiazepines, amphetamines, barbiturates, these are all fully normalized drugs. And even if you go back to the late 19th century, early 20th century, the US had this enormous patent medicine industry with some 50,000 medications on the market at the time. You could walk down to the local pharmacy and get medically pure heroin, cocaine, chloral hydrate, but basically anything that you want that was available at the time. So what I try to do in the book is parse this unique situation in a few ways. So first I do so by drug or class of drugs, and that's basically how the book is organized. So there are 9 chapters in addition to an intro and a conclusion in the book, and those are, I should know this without looking, coffee, cigarettes, alcohol, opiates, amphetamines, psychotropics, psychedelics, cocaine, and marijuana. Each of those gets its own chapter, and those chapters relay the drug's modern history. I broke it up that way to try to get different angles on the question of American exceptionalism, really. So the kind of story that you tell about America through the lens of, say, cocaine obviously differs from that of the story you get through the lens of amphetamines, even though, pharmacologically, they're very similar drugs in terms of their effects. Culturally, they're quite disparate. The second way I do so is through historical periodization, and in the intro, I sort of break up the territory covered in the book into 4 different periods. And in each of these, the particular stressors of American society are processed in slightly different ways that I'll talk more about in a bit. The first period is roughly industrialization through the interwar period. Again, you get this enormous patent medicine industry, but it's also the beginning of domestic drug controls. So in 1914, the Harrison Act prohibits opium and cocaine for the first time. It's the first national drug prohibition effort, and you get various enforcing acts that make that a reality. It's also the beginning of global drug controls, and these were really pushed by the United States, again, specifically around opium and cocaine. The second period is the Fordist period. So you get this rising consumer society, the temperance cause, the sort of old paternalism dies for good, I would argue. And this is the time of peak consumption of coffee and cigarettes, again, amphetamines, barbiturates, benzodiazepines. These are all fully normalized, sort of like the adult candy of the post-war period, sometimes easily available by prescription, sometimes just over the counter. The third period coincides with sort of neoliberalism, and it's conveniently inaugurated with the acute phase of the war on drugs launched by Nixon in the early 70s. You get this new prohibitionist attitude, a ballooning of the carceral system. And then finally, the final period is currently the one that we're currently living through. I would say the war on drugs continues apace in a lot of ways, but I would argue in zombified form. Like, no one really believes in it. It's long been critiqued by the left, but even now on the right, you get figures saying, look, this just doesn't work, specifically the libertarian right, which has long been a critic of the war on drugs. In its place, we're seeing broad decriminalization and legalization trends. It's a really interesting inflection point. I think that we're going to see really new kinds of experiments, both in medical and recreational drug use in the coming years. You can sort of see this going in waves. So you got, crackdown with industrialization, normalization of many drugs in the post-war period. again, cracked down with neoliberalism, and then today you see a new normalization. The post-war normalization and today's differ in important ways, which we could get into. But that's the book, and you could really say the question all of this material circles around is, again, why us? Like, why do we, in a fairly unique way amongst different industrialized nations, like, why do we so love taking drugs, and why do we so demonizing drugs? I have kids, so this actually makes me feel more comfortable hearing that. Well, so there's a simple answer to this question in the book, and there's a much more complicated historical answer behind it. And I'll start with the simple answer. The simple answer is that Americans are, I would argue, amongst denizens of other industrialized countries, uniquely subject to the predations of capitalist society. That there aren't really countervailing forces or structures out there to mitigate the effects of the market. And I mean that in a few different senses. So there's, things like direct-to-consumer advertising. This thing that we're really used to, where we see pharmaceutical ads on television, that just doesn't exist in most countries. It's us and New Zealand that allow direct-to-consumer advertising. So that's just like one of the ways in which we're preyed upon by the pharmaceutical industry. But I mean that in a much more general sense as well. We don't have workers' parties or labor parties. We don't have a history of them. We have weak and fairly segmented unions, a decaying associational life more broadly, a frayed social safety net. And so in the absence of these countervailing forces, the kinds of things that would provide some modicum of personal and social security, I basically think that we're prone to both excessive moralizing about drugs in this case, on the one hand, and excessive medication. And in that sense, in the book, I kind of see drug prohibitionism and drug enthusiasm as almost two sides of the same coin. There are ways in which we cope with or deal with the seemingly intransigent social structures around us. We adapt, we cope, we take the quick fix, in short. Just to talk a little bit about the title for a second, just to spell it out, I mean that both drugs are themselves quick fixes. So, they provide pharmacological relief where maybe work or working through or some kind of longer fix is needed. But I also mean that drug policy has provided quick fixes for us as well. So just to take some examples, legislating against opium in the 19th century, cocaine in the 1910s, marijuana in the 1930s, psychedelics in the 60s, crack in the 80s, and so on and so forth. These have kind of helped smooth things over so that we don't have to deal with the underlying problems. So instead of dealing with issues of immigration, racism, the politics of new social movements, the problems of what some social scientists call the surplus population, instead of dealing with all that, we get drug laws, and they provide that quick fix. And I should say finally about the title, lest I be confused for a moralist about drugs, I think drugs are terrific. I think they're, in general, a very tremendous benefit to human beings. I think most people, most of the time, report positive experiences from their past drug use. So when I say that drugs are quick fixes, I don't mean to denigrate the experience at all. But anyone who has gone on YouTube and searched for home repair improvements, you know that a quick fix is a real fix. It's a real fix, and sometimes it's the fix that you need. The question of the book, though, is how many quick fixes can you stitch together and still have a viable structure before it starts falling apart? And I would argue that we're at this moment where we're in a real deep need for some bigger structural fixes. All right, so that's the simplified answer to the question before us. Now I want to get into a little bit of the more complicated historical answer, but for the full answer, just read the book. I talked a minute ago about the historical periodization of the book, and the first period I really want to delve into specifically, and I do this in the alcohol and opiates chapters in the book. It's the late 19th century, early 20th century. It's when you saw temperance really cohere as a cause. So there had been more local experiments in temperance in the early 19th century, the Maine laws and whatnot, but it's really only with postbellum industrialization that you get this national movement that takes off. And this results most famously in Prohibition from 1920 to 1933. It also, as I said earlier, results in the Harrison Act in 1914 and global drug controls pushed by the United States. So again, to ask for this particular period, why us? Why is it that the United States sort of led the charge in these moral reform efforts? And I don't think we fully appreciate this often. Like, we banned alcohol for 13 years. We totally banned alcohol for 13 years. Like, that should be a pretty remarkable fact about American history. We absolutely love alcohol. We love it. In the early 19th century, we were soaked in alcohol. There's a history of the period from 1790 to 1820 that's called the Alcoholic Republic. Whiskey was social currency. Sometimes it was actual currency. We Americans who love this substance, we banned it for 13 years. There were some limited sort of experiments in prohibition elsewhere, sort of much more limited in scale and time frame, but it's nothing that that compares to the success of the American temperance movement. So why did we make it happen? Well, temperance was about a lot of things. It was about evangelical spirit, certainly a sort of dominant religious element there. It's a certain middle-class status anxiety. There was a lot of direct anti-immigrant sentiment, particularly directed at the Irish and immigrant Catholics more generally. And it was absolutely about worker discipline. So many business leaders of the time, they were not always taken in by the moralism of the temperance movement, but they certainly agreed with it insofar as they wanted an efficient workforce, and they thought that that liquor was a impediment to that. But I think at root, temperance was essentially a moral response to the social ills that industrial capitalism had unleashed. All of a sudden, there's rapid urbanization, there's very visible poverty in cities. There's also just new forms of intoxication. So, as I said, in the early 19th century, the sheer volume of alcohol drunk was it's exceeded anything that we've got since. I think the estimates are that per capita we were drinking about 3 times as much as we do today. But at the time, alcohol, it was sort of just integrated into the day. It was consumed at meals. It was sort of flowed with the rhythms of a slower agricultural life. Whereas with industrialization, the kind of drinking, the kind of intoxication really differed. So you got quick, hard drinking after work. It wasn't necessarily more, but it was concentrated and it was visible. So the reformers at the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League, they weren't just spinning things out of thin air. So there's very visible social ills to deal with, but as I said at the beginning, unlike in Europe where you got the genesis of very powerful workers' parties and socialist parties, in America you don't really get anything of that power really until the CIO moment in the 1930s. So instead you just get, brutal, bloody repression. You get this internal struggle between a blinkered business unionism and a less influential labor radicalism. And you get an ugly and what the historian Matt Karp would call a de-aligned battle between 2 awful political parties, much like today. So in the absence of any political vehicle for addressing these social ills, you got this tremendous investment in predominantly moral solutions to the problems of capitalist society. You can see very clearly that the reformers had the problems in capitalism in mind, however poorly conceived just by the way they talked about it. So when the 18th Amendment passed, they really celebrated Prohibition as the beginning of the end of poverty, as the end of urban blight, political corruption. I've got a quote here from the Reverend Billy Sunday, who said, "The reign of tears is over. The slums will soon only be a memory. We will turn our prisons into factories and our jails into storehouses and corn cribs." It worked out very well. Representative Andrew Volstead, he's the namesake of the Enforcing Act of the 18th Amendment, the Volstead Act. He said that, quote, "All men will walk with their heads high. All women will smile. All children will laugh. The doors of hell will forever be closed." So in essence, Prohibition, it promised all the goods of capitalism with none of the bad part. And I don't think we need any extensive review of the failures of Prohibition to know that it didn't succeed. In fact, as the historian Lisa McGurr has argued recently in a book called The War on Alcohol, Prohibition in many ways set the stage for the later war on drugs. So not just in giving police and private militia groups a reason to terrorize poor and black people. This was a time of the resurgence of the Klan. But also the influence is quite, direct in the form of institutional knowledge. When the Bureau of Prohibition shut down, a lot of its officers and, sort of related agencies moved over to the Bureau of Narcotics. So there's a direct link there between the two. So Prohibition, it failed on its own terms, but it also had these pernicious social consequences, much like the war on drugs. But I would say its problems at root, they weren't practical problems, right? There was no better way to carry out Prohibition enforcement. It wasn't just a problem of lax or corrupt enforcement. I think the problem was substantive. Prohibition failed because it wanted to change capitalist society through a direct moral paternalism rather than through mass working class politics. And so in this early period, I see, the question of why us when it comes to drug prohibitionism to be very intimately related to that old question of why no socialism in the US. I'll talk about one more historical period maybe, and then I'll hand it over to Emily and Christian. And that's the post-war period. And there's two bits here that I think are important to emphasize in answering the question, again, like why us? The first is that the Second World War made it incredibly clear to many people in the military intelligence complex that we had to control all the drugs. We had to control it all. Seizing international drug flows was a top priority. If you don't get key drugs in the right places, as well as have access to their precursor substances, your soldiers are going to suffer, your population at large is going to suffer. And so the US was dead set on controlling all the drugs. They became the gateway for international drug flows in the post-war period. And this is one component, I think, of why how it became the global hegemon. The historian Susanna Rice has a great book about this period, and it's simply called "We Sell Drugs." And I think it's a really blunt way of getting at the basic aim here. We wanted to be the biggest drug dealer around, and I think that's part of the reason why we have a uniquely large and very profitable pharmaceutical industry today. There's another story that I won't get into too much. I think Christian's going to talk about it, which is that the U.S. also wanted to control illegal global drug flows. And I'm sure some of you are aware of this history, but the U.S. has been intimately involved, not just in curbing sometimes illegal drug flows, but also in supporting them. Typically when it meant that anti-communist groups, were growing poppies or coca or whatever in order to fund their insurgencies. So the French Connection, the Kuomintang in exile, the Mujahideen, the Contras, it's the same template basically throughout. The second thing about this period that helps us understand why us is what happened to the great working class upsurge of the 1930s. The Great Depression was obviously a radial crisis. It affected all of society, the very fundaments. And it took some time and limited recovery to see some kind of organization in the face of it. But when it happened, it was similarly fundamental. You read accounts of 1934, the sit-down strikes of 1937. There's this sense that everything was going to change, or at least there was the possibility that everything was going to change. And it did change in a way. I think we do a disservice to the CIO moment and to the New Dealers in saying that it was just co-opting working class unrest or something. The period of affluence to follow, it was absolutely real. It was something in which the working class participated. I would say it constituted something of a revolution in life for the working class. But what it didn't change was management's prerogative. And I'm not going to name names and get into very complicated territory here, but for a variety of reasons, the material security of the era and the working class uplift more broadly, it was kind of bought at the expense of a broader vision for changes in the workplace and in society. And so you got this great affluence of the period at the same time that workers felt increasingly like they just had to conform. You had to conform to the dictates of this new society if you were to participate in that affluence. And I would say that this unique situation of the post-war compromise, it's really the base condition that allowed the polydrug use of the era to exist. So cigarettes, coffee, amphetamines, barbiturates, et cetera. Also really fun amphetamine barbiturate combinations, like pharmaceutical companies like led the way in creating speedballs. You can have it all, just conform to the existing dictates. So that's just a little, bit of historical parsing of the basic question. Could go on to talk about the neoliberal period and the present, which again, it's fairly unique. I'm reticent to make predictions, but I think that we're going to see very unthinkable new forms of drug use in the next decades. I can't see much stopping the legalization trends that we're seeing right now. But I'll stop there. I'll turn it over to Emily and Christian, and we'll have a conversation about it.
This one? All right. Well done. Congratulations on this fantastic book, Ben. And thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. This is, I've been reading Ben's work a long time. It's a great book. I don't know if there's another one like it, actually, that's a synthesis of all of the literature, right? There's lots of books about this or that drug, but this is the first really good synthesis of the whole panorama. So I commend you for doing that, and I recommend it for people. So what struck me in reading this and reading the book and thinking about the question of like, why us, one element that kept coming out for me in Ben's telling of the tale, which I agree with entirely, was the role of the security agencies, the role of the police, the role of the national security state, the role of the intelligence services, and particularly the role of the CIA and its role within American empire and the role that drugs play in that. And more generally, in thinking about the police and the security agencies and their role, what emerges in reading this book is just how iatrogenic the problem is, right? Iatrogenic diseases are diseases that are caused by medicine, right? And it's like the policing agencies are very fundamental in the continual production of the drug crisis. So, and part of what drew my attention to this was that we're in a moment now when the left is, it seems, probably not the left in this room, but the left in the broadest sense of the word, including, liberals in Congress, are not critical of the CIA or the FBI or these agencies. And there is, in fact, a congressional committee looking into this. There are hearings on these agencies, and the left is hostile to this effort, right? And the right is trying to turn this into the new church committee, and they want to go after the intelligence agencies because they feel that the intelligence agencies have gone after them and gone after Trump. And what is, of course, motivating the left, broadly defined, and probably not the left in this room, but elements of the left to oppose this effort is terror of the idea of Donald Trump being reelected. And I think this is very unfortunate because these agencies are absolutely pernicious, gigantic, and totally out of control. And they need to be discussed, and they need to be analyzed and confronted. So, in particular, the CIA, in the post-war part of this story, plays a very important role in the story of heroin, LSD, and cocaine, right? And in reading those three stories in this book, I had a question, which was, how aware was the CIA that creating drug subcultures had some utility as a form of social control for the American ruling class and the American security state? And we don't know. And for those of you who might not be aware of this, the CIA had a whole illegal domestic program, Operation Chaos, that was exposed as part of the Church Committee investigations in the late 70s. And the CIA managed to destroy the vast majority of the information associated with that. This is called the family jewels, and they just totally destroyed it. So we know very little about that program, except we do know that they infiltrated the New Left, right? So if you look at the story of heroin, and Ben tells these stories very well, right? You know, I think it's even before the CIA is formed, American intelligence officers are working with the Corsican mob who deal heroin in France to subvert the left, particularly the Communist Party, in post-war elections. Coming out of World War II, the Communist Party was very, very powerful in Italy, very, very powerful in France, and a real threat to American hegemony in Western Europe. And so they collaborated with drug dealers, the OSS and other, U.S. intelligence, to undermine the French left. That relationship, that connivance with these drug dealers then carries on for a whole generation and concludes, in Laos, where the U.S. is fighting communism in Laos, the CIA is fighting communism in Laos, in very much the same way, working with paramilitary groups that produce heroin and, in fact, facilitating their trafficking of this heroin into the United States, right? We know all this is Air America, all that stuff. What we don't know is what was the CIA thinking about when the drugs land in the U.S. And in the 60s, heroin is landing in American inner cities just as those communities are at a kind of peak mobilization and a peak radicalization. And heroin definitely plays a role in undermining radical social movements, right? It's like you'd almost have to invent this fact if it didn't already exist, which is that, Huey P. Newton is ultimately, killed in a drug deal in the late 80s, right? But it's like along the way, right? There's repression of the Black Panthers, just to take one example, right? There's repression of the Black Panthers, but there's also the corruption of that movement through drugs, right? An interesting, weird little fact, the lamppost, the club that the Panthers buy, or the West Coast faction of the Panthers buy in the early 70s, which sort of helps draw them down as the West Coast Panthers are becoming kind of just, electoral politics-oriented social democrats. They own the lamppost, and this also draws them down into addiction and the mire of the drug scene. Well, that bar had been owned by an old OSS, a Greek OSS vet who had fought with the precursor to the CIA in Greece. And it was one of the only bars, white-owned bars in Oakland, which was a very racist town. In the 20s, the Klan basically had a quorum on the Oakland City Council, so it was a very racist town. And it was one of the few white-owned bars where black people could hang out and drink. And so they sell it. This guy sells it to Huey P. Newton. No, who knows? Maybe that's just a coincidence. But certainly, heroin helps play a role in the demobilization of black and brown movements in the 1960s. And we don't know what the agency was thinking about that. LSD. The agency is heavily involved in LSD. At first, they're interested as part of MK Ultra. They're interested in using LSD for reprogramming and as a truth serum, and they do horrendous, unbelievably awful, illegal, torturous experiments on all sorts of people, American citizens. Whitey Bulger, the famous Boston mobster, was a youth detained in a facility in Lexington where people were given time off their sentences if they participated in these MK Ultra experiments. And the guy was dosed like I forget what it is, but hundreds of times I think it was. Slept for 20 years with the lights on, and as a result became a violent sociopath. All of those efforts fail. CIA realized, well, you can't actually reprogram people. You can't. The LSD is not a truth serum. But Martin Lee, who wrote probably the first book on this stuff, Acid Dreams, ends that book with a question of sort of, well, how much did the CIA know about, or what did they think about the role of LSD in helping to turn the New Left inward, in taking the sort of outwardly focused culture of revolution and not wiping out and negating it, but through the psychedelic subculture, helping to cultivate a kind of revolution of the interior. And LSD is part of how it hits the streets in the US is that the CIA is going to experiment with a limited release in Haight-Ashbury, and there's some sort of mistake in the amount of LSD that's purchased from Hoffman, the Swiss chemist who discovers LSD. The agency purchases through a military, US military procurement officer or something in Europe, the wrong amount, a huge amount of LSD. And so, I mean, that's part of what leads to that whole movement. And yeah, like it was something like 10,000 times more than, like, I think the guy who bought it, like, didn't know the difference between, like, you know, milligrams, micrograms, whatever. But, you know, and so that helps, I think, you know, turn the New Left into an increasingly kind of esoteric, inward-looking cultural movement, a subculture, turning it from a set of movements into a subculture. Then you've got cocaine, and you know that story really begins in earnest with the Sandinista revolution in 1979, and the Somoza dictatorship is overthrown, and Somoza's National Guard, his Praetorian Guard, many of them fall back across the Nicaraguan border into Honduras, where they are met by CIA operatives who start helping them reorganize and start funding them. And we know about all of this because, in fact, and so along the way, what happens, the Contras start waging war on the Sandinistas, and they rape and kill 4 American nuns. And this pisses off even conservative Catholics to the point where there are otherwise quite anti-communist congresspeople who are Catholics who are like, oh, they're the ones who kill nuns, rape and kill nuns? Yeah, okay, sign me up. And the Bolin Amendment is passed, and this is a limit on the Reagan administration's aid to the Contras. It says there can't be any lethal aid. Now, of course, money's fungible, so whatever. But it does create some limits for the Contras and for the agency. And so at that point, that sort of intelligence community, because it's not just the CIA, it's also Oliver North operating directly out of the White House, they start facilitating cocaine trafficking by the Contras into the United States, and with the profits buying weapons to move down to Honduras to facilitate the fight against these socialists. It's rather mild socialists, the Sandinistas. We know all this because one of the supply planes is shot down, an American supply plane, and one of the only survivor is a veteran of the CIA's operations in Laos, Eugene Hassenfuss, and he'd flown for Air America, and he is led out of the jungle by a Sandinista soldier, and Hassenfuss has on him a black book that has Oliver North's phone number and, like, you know, CIA agents' phone numbers, and all of this blows up, and there are, in fact, congressional hearings convened by John Kerry that go on for the entire summer, or a large part of the summer of 1987, and are broadcast from morning till the end of the business day on NPR. All other programming is superseded. And I was painting a house as a teenager that summer, and we'd listen to this all day, every day. It was mind-blowing stuff. Amazingly, this is all, and what's revealed is that, lo and behold, you know, the paranoid-sounding worst-case scenario was in fact occurring, that the CIA was helping its paramilitary forces, the Contras, import drugs into the United States so as to get around the Bolin Amendment. And these are US senators explaining this on the radio. This is all remarkably totally forgotten within the course of 9 years, and then Gary Webb in 1996, an investigative reporter for the San Jose Mercury News, writes up the whole story again as if the Kerry committee never happened. And at that time, there's this a tremendous kind of outpouring of rage from the African-American community, from people, rank-and-file people, and also from political leaders, Maxine Waters among them. And at that time, a lot of black people asked this question, or supposed or accused, that part of what the CIA was also doing was undermining the black community. Some people linked this to the political history of organizing of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement and all that. And some people just thought it was just racism, right? There's just a bunch of racists, and they're they're attacking us yet again. And there is ultimately no answer to that question, which is like, well, what about that side of it? What was the agency doing in these cases? Was the creation of drug subcultures that seem in many ways to have helped to blunt political movements, disorganize political movements, distract people. Was that intentional? Were they conscious of that? Or was that purely a byproduct that they didn't think of? We may, in fact, never know the answer to that, but it's one that kept recurring for me when reading this. So I guess I would, I'd like to know what you think about all that, ultimately. So it's a great book. I highly recommend it to everyone.
Hello. My name is Emily Dufton. I am a writer and drug historian, which I assure you is a real job. I'm so happy to be here. This is a lovely event. It's wonderful to be back in New York. I did my undergrad at NYU. It feels good to be home. One of Ben's orienting claims is that drug policy is not about drugs. Amen. Ain't that the truth? My first book, as Ben said, was about the history of cannabis activism from about the 1960s to 2016 when my editor demanded the manuscript. And I'm currently working on a book on the history of the development and privatization of not opioids, but the medications that assist with opioid addiction. Not OxyContin, not heroin, but methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone. Two very different orients of drugs, right? Cannabis comes from a very different world that opioids do. So I'll talk a little bit about how Ben's orienting claim that drug policy is not about drugs very much applies to these two specific drugs. Cannabis is a really interesting drug. I walked past how many dispensaries walking over here, and they are supposed to give us what? Social justice? It's working great, isn't it? It's great. It's fantastic. When cannabis became a larger part of American society in the 1960s, it was seen as a moment of the countercultural revolution, right? You were turning against that man in the gray flannel suit. You were not going to support the war in Vietnam. You were not going to support Fordism. You were not going to support the various things that were undergirding global capitalism that the United States was coming out of as we superseded the rest of the global economy in the outcome of World War II. We were going to take over, and what cannabis consumption represented, of course, was an alternative to that. As we now watch it become a commodity, as it becomes something that is earning more than, God, what was the article that I was reading? We spend more on cannabis now, illegal cannabis, not the black market, which continues to exist, the illicit market, which continues to exist, than I think on chocolate. It's quite stunning. The transformation from the illicit market to the licit market has been one of a transformation of the consumer, right? So my book, Grassroots, was about the kind of grassroots activism that basically allowed for such a thing to happen. A lot of people throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s were pushing very much to allow for the access to this specific substance. It was seen as something that was a countervailing notion to what was sort of going on in the larger conversations about America. Also, it allowed for the countervailing notion of the parent movement in the 1980s. It was the anti-marijuana movement in the 1980s, it was specifically in the 1970s actually, that allowed for Nancy Reagan to take on the Just Say No movement as her primary benchmark. There was a lot going on there. its transformation into a commercial commodity, I think, is something that we have to watch very closely. It's not something that I think most of the activists in the 1960s expected, and not something that they necessarily wanted. This was supposed to be something that was outside of the larger scales of capitalism, that was supposed to represent something that we were moving against towards these larger notions. It has not become that way, and I think we should become suspicious of what's going on with these markets. We're watching the money go into it, but I don't think that they're supposed to look like Apple stores. Right? I live outside of DC. DC is a very interesting place, of course, because it's legal in DC. The sales of cannabis are, well, I can't even go into the specifics of it. But DC dispensaries are kind of holes in the wall where it's still very underground. But I actually live right outside of DC in Maryland, and Maryland dispensaries look like Starbucks. Do we want cannabis dispensaries to look like Starbucks? Is that truly achieving the countercultural dream of what cannabis is supposed to represent? We have to think about these things. Now, it's true that fewer people are being arrested for it, but it is also becoming a totally typicalized commodity. These are things we have to consider. My larger questions, though, are not so much about cannabis, but opioids. Opioids are really an interesting substance, aren't they? One of the things that Ben talks about in this excellent book is that drug use is a product of atomization, a product of our splitting of American culture, where we are really struggling with kind of finding any sort of meaning for purpose for life. Opioids fill that void, but they also cause significant problems of their own. The issue with the opioid treatment market, which I have been studying very closely for the past too long, my editor is also very desperate for this manuscript, is that we are turning the treatment market into something that resembles any other commercial market. We are selling the treatment for the cure. This is a real issue. We're struggling with so many problems right now, and I know that you all are extraordinarily familiar with them. Gosh, I didn't have any notes for this stuff, so I'm like sort of struggling right now with what I'm going to say. But Ben's talking about a capitalist approach to the drug market. And both cannabis and opioids are trying to fill those fixes, right? These are quick fixes. Where cannabis was trying to fill the countercultural approach, where we were trying to find ways to go around the larger dominating forces, opioids are unfortunately filling that void. We are feeling a lot of pain. And then we have an entire market to fill the void for the people who are also feeling that pain. There's a lot of problems with this, particularly with methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone, which are the drugs that I've been studying. When it comes to methadone, and specifically buprenorphine, these are called the gold standard of treatment for opioid use disorder, also known as opioid addiction. We have come to the point where the fix has become essentially franchised. Methadone clinics are existing in a closed system where only clinic operators who both register with the HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, and of course with the DEA, they're the only people who are allowed to provide this option for individuals who need some kind of maintenance program. The methadone clinics act essentially as parole officers. They're extraordinarily difficult programs for people to enter. They're only located in certain areas because there's a lot of NIMBYism, numerous amounts of state and local regulations that don't allow these clinics to exist. With buprenorphine, we've actually moved to the opposite length, which is that it has become entirely privatized. It's only private physicians who are allowed to prescribe this drug, and the only private physicians who are interested in doing this are the ones who are essentially interested in selling these prescriptions. You charge $150, $200 per visit. The people who are interested in getting buprenorphine to quell their cravings and withdrawal symptoms for opioid use disorder will pay that money and then get their prescription filled. We have turned not only opioids, such as heroin and fentanyl, into a stark commodity, but we have turned their treatment into a stark commodity. So what are we doing with that? If we've transformed the countercultural notions of cannabis into a commodity, and we have these beautiful, quite stunning dispensaries available for that, and we've also turned not only the access to opioids, but also their cure into stark commodities. What are we doing with this situation? It goes back to Ben's larger arguments that not only have we we have an extraordinarily large prohibitionist tendency, but there's a lot of draws to make a lot of money off of this situation. And we are turning users into personal ATMs, right, for a growing number of individuals, but also companies that are interested in exploiting them. There's also, of course, the massive exploitation of Medicare and Medicaid. What we're dealing with right now in the United States, when I talk to a number of federal officials, is that we have an aging population that is using a growing number of drugs. And the amount of money that is going to Medicaid coverage after the ACA to pay for the massive number of drugs that are dealing with addiction, it's a lot of money. If we're coming at it from a perspective where we have an interest in providing a social safety net and caring for the individuals around us, the United States, of course, spends more money on healthcare than any other country in the entire world. Most of that money could be better spent, of course, by diverting it to systems of larger social care. We're spending it, of course, on healthcare because the healthcare system is so hugely blown up. By providing brand name Suboxone as opposed to the generics, we're spending $857 million a year. You're paying for this. Congratulations. Thank you for paying for Suboxone for these people who need it. Could we be paying a third of that money less? We certainly could. But we're not. When I was researching this book, I went to Switzerland about 2 months ago, and I was spending a lot of time in their addiction treatment clinics there. Switzerland, I know, is a very different country from the United States. Its entire population could fit on this island, right? It could fit on the island of Manhattan. Every single person there has health insurance. But the treatment that I saw in Switzerland was an entirely different world from what I see in the United States. I have been to numerous Suboxone clinics. I've been to numerous methadone clinics as I've been researching this book. All of them are terrible. All of them are awful, which is the reason why we have over 100,000 deaths, overdose deaths in the United States right now. In Switzerland, they have no visible drug use on the streets, and they do not have overdose deaths. They have not only cut down on opioid use, but they have treated it and turned it into an essentially livable condition. Why is that? Well, because everyone has access to low threshold opioid agonist treatment, not only from methadone, which is not the most popular drug, but certainly from long-acting morphine, and also from heroin-assisted treatment, which is only available for about 1,500 people, and it comes with its own series of federal regulations, but they take care of people. They also incorporate them into a larger system of social care, where they have access to things like housing. They have access to things like healthcare. They have access to things like assistance with finding jobs. They have access to drug consumption rooms, which takes a lot of the visible drug use from streets, which we, of course, deal with daily in America, into a system where I would say the chaos continues to exist, but is certainly controlled. There are ways to move forward with our drug problem. We do not have to spend the egregious amounts of money that we spend in a variety of systems, mostly going to corporations, private corporations. But there are ways to solve this drug problem. Other countries have done it, and we can follow their examples by actually modifying what we do to better follow their example. Switzerland took everything that we had done in the United States. We created the system of methadone, we created the system of buprenorphine, but they brought it into their own system and modified it to the point where they made it available to individuals at a low threshold orientation. They also gave them access to various other things that they needed, and they now have now the problem that they're dealing with is an aging drug-using population. They have kept these individuals alive for so long that now they're dealing with problems of aging that we would all deal with. Heart failure, cancer. We can make drug use a livable situation, but we don't. We choose not to. And I think that if we look at some of Ben's orienting claims in a larger context where we could actually use some of these ideas about drugs to orient them towards the idea of keeping individuals alive long enough to allow them to die natural deaths, we could deal with the drug problem in the United States without some of the prohibitionist and some of the entirely negative and some of the entirely incarceration-oriented problems that we're dealing with right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. Very different but very helpful comments. I'll try to keep it brief, and then maybe we can get to Q&A soon. Iatrogenic is a really good term, I think, in a lot of different respects. So with the CIA, but you could see this run throughout sort of drug policy and pharmaceutical practices. So with pharma, for instance, right? Like one sort of prominent problem in the United States is cascading drug treatments. So they define diagnoses and drug effects so narrowly that when you put someone on, say, amphetamines and they become noticeably anxious and jittery, they then diagnose you with a different problem for which you're put on a different drug, right? So that's sort of iatrogenic practices in psychopharmacology. You could think of it, just sort of like basic policing practices as well. When you incentivize cops through different forfeiture laws to prioritize drug busts, they're just going to do that. And of course, drug bust numbers goes up, and the justification for doing it in the first place is sort of like it comes after the fact. And so in all these ways, you can think about like the drug war and drug policy more broadly as iatrogenic. They're silly in themselves. There's a psychologist in New York named Carl Hart who says only children could believe in the drug war, right? It just doesn't make sense. Like I think we know, like you can't stop. You can't stop drug production. You can't deal with distribution, and you can't intimidate addicts out of their addiction. You just have to. You can move drug production around, but you just can't stop the flow of drugs per se. But in addition to that, it bears all sorts of other pernicious consequences that then sort of like feed back into drug policy. Your basic question, like, how much do we know?
What role do drug subcultures play as a form of social control?
Right.
Because maybe the reason we don't have better policies is because it's recognized, like, elites, the ruling class, look down at the poorest, most racially marginalized communities and think we don't want them to be organized. We don't want that to be a healthy community. We don't want people to start coming together and come up with solutions to the real problems, because that's going to be expensive. That means sharing power. That means higher taxes. Who knows what that means? That's a slippery slope. Better to just keep these people busy with whatever problems are occurring through our current policies, rather than, turning to Switzerland and say, wait a minute, maybe that would work.
Yeah, there's a famous quote from a Nixon deputy, John Ehrlichman, where he says something like, I'm paraphrasing now, but he says, what were we against then? Well, we were against black people in the New Left. You can't make it illegal to be black. You can't make it illegal to be on the New Left. But by demonizing these substances and associating those groups with these substances, you could attack them in other ways. he kind of said the quiet part loud in a way, but I think we kind of all know that that's part of the game, that when it comes to drug policy, other kinds of social issues are being dealt with. One thing you didn't mention was the Rand Corporation, and there has been some research into them. They have done all sorts of insidious things, including designing counter-revolutionary strategies to be deployed in Vietnam and whatnot. But we know that they at least contemplated the use of LSD for the pacification of New Left activists. This was like an actual plan that they came up with. Whether or not it was implemented, I don't know. But it is difficult not to see something of the horrifying birth of psychedelics in America with MK Ultra. It's difficult not to see something of that in the New Left counterculture. Yeah, I mean, as Christian said, MK Ultra, other than maybe the Nazi Biological Sciences Division and Unit 731 in Japan, the most horrifying things that human beings have ever done to other human beings, that I've read about at least. And
More things that you haven't read about.
I'm sure but they were very systematic in doing it. I think it's the systematicity of it that's really frightening there. And they wanted complete control over the human mind. It's difficult not to see some elements of the vast quantities of LSD that leaked from the CIA into elite circles first in the 50s and then eventually into the New Left in the 60s. It's difficult not to see something there. And I mean, it's all speculation at a certain point, but all of the pernicious tendencies of the left and the disjunction of the left's practical proposals with actually existing social reality, you can kind of see some reflection of the drugs in that disjunction, I guess. Also, Gary Webb was shot twice in the head, and it was declared a suicide. To turn to Emily's comments, to the new moment that we're in, I think that you really clearly sort of describe the real ambivalence of the moment. I think that the left's instinctive position has always been to just categorically be against drug prohibitionism, right? To point to the failures of the war on drugs, the pernicious consequences of the war on drugs, and say, that's the position. We're kind of in a new moment now. We're in a moment where Elon Musk and Peter Thiel are getting on social media and saying how great their ketamine trips are, right? It's a very different moment where it's not just undoing the damage caused by the war on drugs. It's also thinking through like what legalization means. It's the legal drugs, specifically cigarettes and alcohol, that have been the most injurious to American society, right? They are the drugs that have caused the most deaths and harm. And putting psychedelics, marijuana, who knows what else next, into the hands of CEOs, who knows what's going to come from that. Yeah, and I guess one last thing I'll mention before just giving the mic back to you all. In the 70s, which is, in my experience, kind of when a lot of the good books about drugs were written, it was this interesting moment before this one's okay. It was before like the Reagan backlash, and it was after like the 60s countercultural excesses. And so there's this moment where a lot of people thought cocaine was going to quickly become a legal drug, where everyone's like, yeah, marijuana, it's fine. Like, this is going to become legal any day. I think 12 states decriminalized it at the time. That was rolled back 13. And so it's kind of this moment of clarity. There was this group called Amorphia, and it's sort of a little bit lost to history, but it was once a competitor of NORML, you'd know better than me, the National Organization for Marijuana, for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. NORML's still in existence. There's still sort of like marijuana lobbying organization. And NORML has had its own history, but Amorphia kind of broke with them for a few different reasons. I think the head of Amorphia slept with the wife of the head of NORML. That's one reason. But they also absolutely opposed legalization. They were pro-marijuana, absolutely against legalization. They're like, we do not want the alcohol model for marijuana. We want free backyard grass. Anything else is going to be corrupted in various ways. And I think something of that critique is missing in the present enthusiasm for various legalization movements today.
I mean, no, I think we should open up to questions.
That was pretty much my
Okay.
question. Well, what do we do? can't legalize. What do we do?
Yeah, let's go to questions. Let's go to questions. Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so you mentioned the sort of microdosing thing, right? Elon Musk recently said that he microdoses ketamine every day to deal with his depression, which makes a lot of his decisions regarding Twitter make a lot of sense. But I was wondering what you make of this sort of microdosing hype that you see now in a lot of Silicon Valley circles, and like even some people on the left that I listen to are like, I microdose drugs and it's great and has cured my depression. I'm interested in what you make of that whole phenomenon.
Yeah, it's growing more prevalent, certainly. I think it's a testament to just how brutally instrumentally we can treat different drugs. I mean, psychedelics, they potentially allow us to get to the outer bounds of consciousness. And now we have, tech bros using them to sparkle at their work parties and whatnot. It makes sense as an alternative to amphetamines and other kinds of drugs, even just coffee. They work. I think that there's sort of two modalities to the current psychedelic renaissance. One is very much medical, and that's proceeding apace. MDMA was supposed to be approved by the FDA this year. I think it's getting pushed back to the first quarter of 2024. So MDMA is soon going to be a available drug for psychiatrists to prescribe. I think psilocybin shortly after that will be available. And given the synthetic possibilities of psychedelics, you can go to arrowwood.org and read about all sorts of drugs you've never heard of before. There could be new combinations thereof as well. And that's being carefully curated. The leading lights of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, they think the 60s was a huge mistake. Right? They're like, we had promising research into the therapeutic potential of these drugs. It was ruined by Tim Leary and the rest, and now we're bringing it back. And they're very careful about guarding it. So, all the psychedelic studies that they're funding, they want to make sure everything's in place so that, like, when psychedelics do become legal, we don't have a repeat of the 60s and the subsequent crackdown. The other element of it, which is very closely related, is, as you say, the sort of recreational use. But I think it's the way in which it's come back is pretty interesting. It's sort of about using psychedelics to optimize ourselves rather than to go on voyages of self-discovery or whatnot. And it speaks to a lot of the imperatives of the present.
I had a question about like the new companies marketing like non-alcoholic beverages that sort of seem like often like a remarketing of like tea or soda essentially as a fix to something like alcoholism or alcohol abuse. And I'm a bartender, and it's also in a lot of ways a response to like the lower drinking, like less drinking populations out of like especially younger people. But it seems like sort of a deeply capitalist response to concerns about alcohol abuse, maybe coming off of COVID, but also an aging population that has abused alcohol for so long. But yeah, I guess just that's it.
I think that's so important. I talk to a lot of college classes, and I have to say, as the Monitoring the Future program is a survey that's been conducted by the University of Michigan since 1972, and it is such a resource on national drug use trends. And they just released a really fantastic PDF of national drug use trends from 1972 to 2023, and I highly recommend you all download it and read it. Drinking is so down among Gen Z, Because, and every time I talk to a college class, it's because they have been so inundated with medications throughout their entire life. They're uninterested in illicit drugs. They are uninterested in marijuana. They're uninterested in cocaine. No one uses really cocaine anymore. That has, after the crack crisis, I think since about 1996, the rates of cocaine use have plummeted. We see cannabis rising primarily among middle-aged people. Binge drinking among 35 to 60-year-olds is at its peak right now. We are drinking more than ever, but young people are not. And the marketization of non-alcoholic drinks, of course, is just sort of following in that line of transforming an interest into a commodity. But we have to watch that, right? I think young people are the, of course, arbiters of what is going to be coming next. I am fascinated by what they're saying to me. They have no interest in drinking. They have no interest in illicit drugs. Very few have interest in driving, right? The things that marked the counterculture previously are now no longer marks of the counterculture. But this is a generation that has been doped up since they were children. They've been on ADHD medication. They have been on anxiety medication. They've been on depression medication. So I would say to anyone who's working in the care fields, specifically in addiction medicine, you have a whole new world coming at you, and it's going to be a fascinating transformation. But the marketization of non-alcoholic drinks, or specifically cannabis drinks, right? We're trying to, again, market things to this generation because, of course, they still have fungible money to spend, and we still have to, try to sell them whatever they have. But it's a different world. The illicit drugs that have marked deviance or the counterculture for decades are no longer what is marking deviance right now. And it is going to be a fascinating transformation to watch continue to unfold over the next couple of decades. Is anyone here in the care field? Anyone in addiction medicine? Okay, I see a couple of hands. That's good. Congratulations, you're doing God's work.
My previous neighbor just so happened to be a non-alcoholic beverage distributor, and he's a former alcoholic, and I talked to him a lot about it. And he's I think that he got into it for personal reasons, but I think that he saw a certain market trend to have different kinds of options for different kinds of people that speak to different kinds of concerns. And I think to some extent the wide variety of non-alcoholic beverages we have now is sort of forecasting things to come. I think cannabis infused drinks are sort of like one avenue. I talked to someone in Seattle the other day who was looking for startup cash to explore the possibility of creating a nightclub where there's no alcohol served whatsoever, but where you got, psilocybin 2CB sort of like drink mixtures, right? Instead, you could sort of like pick the kind of drug cocktail that you wanted, and alcohol wasn't even part of the picture. For someone like me who's about ready to go to the bar right now, that's kind of alienating. Social life for so long has been organized around alcohol in the United States. I think that's breaking apart in a lot of ways, and that in the coming years you'll see a variety of new kinds of leisure markets available.
Has your research changed your conception of what a drug is? What you describe as a drug?
That's a good question. I don't think I've thought about that. I sort of limited myself from the beginning. Like anything that the scientific textbooks say is a psychoactive drug, I was interested in. And I think that maybe not the conception of the drug, but the conceptions of the boundaries between different drugs was certainly eroded over the course of writing the book. It was purposeful from the start, but I sort of erode the boundary between medical and recreational use altogether, and I talk about psychiatric medications in the same breath as non-psychiatric medications. I was also, maybe interested in adding chapters about non-psychoactive drugs as well. in the United States today with an aging population, as Emily said, the best-selling drugs are not psychoactive drugs. They're, Humira, the cholesterol medication, arthritis medication, stuff like that. And the way in which they're sort of marketing to Medicare recipients is kind of pernicious. But no, I mean, one of the reasons I sort of took on the project beyond just sort of learning about these amazing statistics about drug use is that I've taught a class to undergraduates for a few years now about like the sociology and history of drugs. And students who would never talk about capitalism, let's say, or would never talk about alienation or like the impact of the stressors of society on them, they can talk about drugs. And they like talking about drugs. And drugs in this sense are sort of gateway to sociology and history, the best form of gateway drug. And that's what I've always liked about the sort of the topic, that it's a way to talk about other things about American society through a different kind of lens.
Drugs are a gateway?
Thank you. My question kind of pulls together two of your comments. First, the use of the word optimization, and also your comment about young people and their having been prescribed amphetamine salt derivatives. And so I was kind of wondering what your thoughts were on the kind of mainstream backlash against the prescription of medications like Adderall and Vyvanse, and drugs that are, and this is like my way of asking about the shortage of these drugs this past year without really asking about it. But I was just wondering what you thought about the sort of mainstream backlash against the prescription of these drugs that ultimately kind of do optimize on a workforce and kind of make them conform to the conditions of a society that requires a kind of optimization of work. I understand kind of more leftist critiques of those, and I have some ideas about why there are mainstream, ruling class objections. But one would think that those people would be in favor of the continued use and prescription of drugs like those. So I was just wondering what you thought. Both of you.
Yeah, it just so happens that I had an article published today in the Point magazine about the amphetamine shortage, trying to tackle it. I'm not sure I would characterize it as a mainstream backlash. I don't. There's a lot of panic about it, yeah, and you can occasionally find some caustic remarks on Twitter, as so happens. But I don't think it's necessarily a backlash. I mean, what I try to do in the article is to just historicize it a bit and say, there was a time not that long ago when amphetamines were very available and the kinds of restrictions on them just weren't legible. You could get a methamphetamine inhaler in this country over the counter until 1965. And the old inhalers too, they're not like the sort of like regulated dose inhalers that we have today. The old inhalers, they were metal tubes, and you'd stick a cotton filler soaked in the drug in the tube, and you put a cap on it, and when you wanted a bit of the medication, you pop the cap off, you take a whiff, you put the cap back on. It's not very scientific. Well, it didn't take very long for industrious teenagers to figure out you could take out the cotton filler and swallow it or soak it in a beverage and get a much stronger high. So there were abuses. It's certainly one of the reasons we got the Controlled Substances Act in 1970. There was, reaction against various illegal drugs, but also reaction against sort of the abuse of illicit drugs as well. But today, the boundaries for the distribution of amphetamines is pretty narrow. I mean, it's ADHD and binge eating disorder. And the categories are much more rigid than they used to be, and I think that this causes a lot of angst on sort of both sides, right? It's like people with ADHD sort of saying, "Oh, why is this shortage happening?" Whereas sort of more callous people sort of saying, you just need to learn to grow up and deal with life on its own. There's this nasty sort of it's sort of like been absorbed by the culture war in a lot of ways. But I would argue that a lot of, so long as we uphold these rigid categories, they're naturally going to restrict the supply of amphetamines. And so to some extent, the paradigm within which we understand ADHD today is itself a limiting factor on the supply of amphetamines. You can't just expect regulatory agencies to just sort of open the floodgates while rigidly guarding these categories. And so part of what I want to try to do in the article is say we can think of a world where amphetamines would be much more widely available without the kinds of rigid categories and diagnoses for which they're supposed to be marketed, because the way in which it's talked about, amphetamines help make people's brain, like the patients with ADHD, that helps make their brains normal. That's the sort of official pharmaceutical ad copy. For everyone else, you're abusing it. You're trying to get an A on the tests. You're trying to get a specific high. Well, those are pretty rigid terms, and if that's the case, then I don't think it's surprising there's going to be a restriction in amphetamine supply.
But I think a lot of what you're talking about is coming from a post-pandemic access to telehealth, where a lot of companies rushed in to fill this newfound capitalistic void where you could prescribe amphetamines to anyone who self-diagnosed for ADHD. Those were entirely out of control, and prescriptions did rise rapidly to a number of people who probably did not necessarily require those drugs. Again, we're talking about a capitalist quick fix to a solution. I have diagnosed myself with this problem. I am going to talk to one person for 5 minutes online after filling out a 10-question self-diagnosis test, and I'm suddenly going to be allowed to access very strong intoxicants. One of the reasons why these drugs are no longer available is because so many people suddenly started accessing them. Those companies have been cut down on, which is a good thing. Those were really bad, really bad companies. But because of the telehealth revolution, and suddenly we had a number of people coming in to say, well, if I can sell these drugs, I will sell these drugs. And that's what essentially occurred. When you have the opportunity to sell drugs, a lot of people will sell the drugs. And a lot of people will buy the drugs. So, you know.
No, I mean, just the picture that's emerging in all these comments is one it strikes me as very bleak, right? You know, I was thinking about how the role alcohol has played in revolutions of people getting drunk and then storming the barricades, like that's going down. Everyone's like isolated, you know, and medicating themselves into kind of complacency. I'm a fan of psychedelics. I think that they're, you know, potentially really profound and intense, but it also, I'm thinking about, like, if I'm honest, I think they also lend themselves to a kind of quietism. You know, it's like, I don't think that most people emerge from an intense LSD trip or psilocybin trip thinking like, okay, now let's like tear things up and overthrow the system. It's more like, wow, like everything has a beginning, middle, and an end, and it's like, you know, you don't win them all. So it's pretty depressing contemplating all this. Wasn't there? I thought that the shortage of these amphetamines had to do with the aggregate, right? That you can't just mix these things with anything, and it's like there's. But is it there's actually like a shortage of the drugs, or is it just some weird component that's
a cap on the amount that's allowed to be manufactured?
And that's what the cause is?
Essentially what kind of like the United States thought was what its numerical needs were, and then when that totally exploded during the pandemic, it became...
We're done. We need more. We need seconds on amphetamines. Yeah. Oh, well.
Earlier in your talk, Ben, you described not naming names about the New Deal and maybe some of how the New Deal got undermined and led to this post-war compromise in which management prerogative was maintained, but workers enjoyed an affluence, but under conditions not of their own choosing. And you suggested that had something to do with the post-World War II explosion of drug use. And I'm just wondering if you could maybe take us back to the New Deal era and maybe explain a little bit more about your picture of kind of what were its possibilities, how did it maybe get severely limited or constrained, and then maybe flesh out some of that side of the story about what that has to do with Americans on drugs. Well,
I'm a I'm actually got a separate research project on the history of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and I think their accomplishments are sort of unparalleled in American history and should be appreciated. It's the one moment that we can point to in history where millions of private sector workers joined the labor movement and stayed in the labor movement. It's like pretty unprecedented. That being said, there was an alignment of forces within the CIO that put certain questions off the table, and certainly the Communist Party, when they decided to sort of abandon the dual union strategy and support the CIO, there was no gap really between what John L. Lewis wanted to do and what Gus Hall wanted to do. Their methods might have differed a little bit, but they were united in a certain vision, which was to discipline working class revolt to the end of stable, peaceful collective bargaining. It was a huge advancement, but they left a lot of things off the table in the process. From Lewis on down, the sort of key leaders of the CIO, they never really challenged management's prerogative to run the production process, and so. A lot of the rank and file rebellion of the 60s was over issues of basic workplace control. It wasn't wages. It was like, I can't deal with this speed up right now, and there's no union structures in place to sort of like push back against management when it comes to just dealing with the very stressful job that I have. And in that kind of situation, I think there's sort of twin incentives, right? The affluence is there. It's possible to buy a house and buy a car and support a family with like a working class job. But so long as you give over to the dictates of the workplace and just, sort of become a cog in the machine, it's a very alienating kind of situation to be in. Drugs are unsurprisingly a huge help.
I think we have maybe time for 2 more before we have to start to wrap up, so.
Hey, so I didn't read the book, so I don't know if you addressed this there, but I wanted to ask about fentanyl and the sort of both like the kind of like weird like interaction of like the domestic impact and the international politics of it, because there's we were already hearing about it like during the 2016 election where it's destroying sort of the white working class. Was like came up as a very big like victim of the whole like fentanyl wave, and like the Trump phenomenon was connected with that. And then on the other hand, about how it's become this huge like sore point in U.S.-China relations, and how the U.S. is almost like trying to like restart a war on drugs with fentanyl this time, and trying to like blaming China for a lot of the like inflow of fentanyl into the U.S. and trying to like get China's cooperation on cracking down on fentanyl at the same time that there's all this antagonism in other spheres. So I don't have like a specific question about that. I just wanted to kind of throw it out there if you like had any thoughts on it.
The opiates all the chapters in the book have subtitles, and the subtitle of the opiates chapter is "Civilizing the Orient." Because the history of opiates has always been tied to China somehow, in particular, back to like Chinese opium subcultures in the late 19th century. I mean, as I understand it, I'm not sort of up on the latest here, but as I understand it, one of the difficulties with fentanyl is not necessarily sort of like government cooperation, but the different synthetic possibilities for opioids. So, you can find a particular form of fentanyl and say, okay, we're no longer allowing that to be distributed. But you change one tiny little molecule, and it's basically has the same effect, and then it goes undetected like the next day. And it's legal. The journalist Zachary Siegel has called this opiate whack-a-mole. Like once you get rid of one, like another one pops up. And I should say, I'm generally not very sympathetic to sort of liberal drug reformers, sort of more generally, but they like to say stuff like, any drug can be used safely. And that's certainly true with fentanyl. I mean, fentanyl is still a very effective surgical anesthetic. It's just that it's very powerful, so it's 10 to 50 times as strong as heroin. And so if you mix it improperly, or stored improperly, all sorts of things can go wrong. So it's really just the potency that's the issue. Yeah. Do you have anything else to add on fentanyl?
What's there not to add on fentanyl, right? Ben Westhoff is a good friend of mine. He wrote a beautiful book called Fentanyl Inc., where he actually went undercover into a Chinese lab and was investigating what they were doing. I think what fentanyl and actually the most recent iterations of marijuana do is kind of blow apart that idea of the iron law of prohibition, that like things only get stronger when they're illegal. No, things get stronger when the technology allows them to get stronger. Right now, we are moving into an era of entirely synthetic drugs, right? There is no heroin available in Baltimore. I was at a clinic and talking with researchers at Johns Hopkins University on Wednesday, 2 days ago. There is no heroin in Baltimore anymore. It's almost like heroin is like the botanic, organic, beautiful farm-raised chicken that you know the name of it before it got killed, right? There's no heroin anymore because what synthetic drugs allow producers, no matter where they are, to do is make drugs cheaply. In the exact same way that as cannabis has become legalized, it's only become more potent. Right? It's only become more potent. You can get 1,000 milligram bar of cannabis-laced chocolate in Las Vegas. Of course you can. Of course you can. So the iron law of prohibition that we all said, well, as soon as you make a drug illegal, it's going to get stronger. No, as soon as you make a drug stronger, as soon as you make a drug legal, it's going to get stronger because we have the technologies to make it stronger now. Fentanyl is going to dominate the market for the rest of our living lives. It's never going to go away. It has entirely replaced heroin because it doesn't rely on an agricultural market. You don't have to wait for the rains. You don't have to wait for the sun. You don't have to rely on Afghanistan. You can make it in a lab. It's extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily easy. It's not going to go away. That is a problem for anyone using drugs, as this very cheap, very powerful drug is going to be added to anything. So don't take drugs on the street without testing them. That's my advice for all of you.
Great. I think we have time for one more if it's quick. You had your hand up like the whole time, Christy. All right.
I wanted to ask, it seems like there's been an emerging theme here, and I'm wondering if it's reductionistic to say that in the broad arc of this history of drugs over the past 200 so years in the US, there's been a trend away from like the socialized or socializing potential of drugs toward their atomizing potential. I think that's my main question. I'm also thinking about sort of the recent the use of psilocybin assisted psychotherapy as an emerging thing that, psychoanalysis or psychotherapy has also been used to think about like the psychologization of social problems, and now you have sort of the combination of psychotherapy and psilocybin as a sort of quicker fix to the thing that psychologizes social problems. So yeah, maybe.
Yeah, it's a big question to ask at the end. I think so. I think that's most evident in the way in which we think about and consume alcohol today. So again, in the early 19th century, alcohol was everywhere. But what's particular about it, and what's kind of horrifying, I think, in a lot of respects from our perspective, is just the kinds of social bonds that were involved in alcohol consumption. So it was kind of like the excesses of a frat house writ large, right? If like you walk into a tavern. You'd buy drinks, you'd have drinks. If you didn't reciprocate, that's a problem. If you didn't drink, that's a problem. There's accounts of the time. It's like it's literally, stranger, will you drink or will you fight? Which is a little bit much. But on the other hand, you can see how social bonds were really at stake, right? That drinking was more than just drinking. It wasn't just to like get drunk individually. It was to sort of cement some kind of social relationship. Whereas today you can walk into a bar and say, oh, I don't feel like drinking tonight, or oh, I don't like that particular drink. We all have all these preferences, right? All these preferences that sort of create our individual selves. It's not about immersing in some kind of social collective through drug use. Right? Yeah, and I mean, there's various other ways in which to parse the question as well. I think that Yeah, I provide some advertisements for different pharmaceutical drugs from the 60s and 70s. Some of them are quite horrifying. It's like, are you worried about Cuba and Czechoslovakia? Take Librium. You'll feel better about it. There's one for Syrax with a picture of a housewife behind prison bars of brooms that says, you can't set her free, but you can help her feel less anxious. And it's all directly horrifying, right? But at the same time, there's a certain honesty to it, right? This society that we live in, there's certain stressors that really make us feel bad about ourselves. Here's a bunch of drugs to help you feel better. It's not always the most pleasant conversation, but at least the social reference is included. What's really happened after the biological revolution in psychiatry is that we can't talk about that social reference in the same way, right? So now it's about, different serotonin reuptake or adenosine receptors or something in our brains that like makes us a certain way. And not that underlying brain states aren't involved, but there's also social factors that are often left out of the conversation today. So in all these ways, it has sort of, the trend has been towards individualization and an absence of the social reference.
I wonder what's the chicken and what's egg, because some drugs clearly don't lend themselves to sociality, but a lot of drugs do. And in my youth, I moved furniture in San Francisco, and we would occasionally do amphetamines. We do methamphetamine. Like after it been end of the month, everyone's moving, someone's band's playing. You're like no sleep, and you got to work 16-hour days. And it was like a collective thing. You'd all go from being kind of like hungover and like, we're gonna move these, we're gonna do this, we're gonna get a great tip, it's gonna be awesome, And so, and that that was like a drug that you think, well, that's not necessarily a particularly social drug, but if you're doing it in a social job where you got to cooperate, on one person can't move the couch, and if the other person at the end of the couch isn't paying attention, then you got a problem. So. Yeah, so I don't have an answer, but I wonder what it is. I think you're totally right, but is it the shift in drugs, or is it just that we're working alone, we're living online, and all this other stuff?
I know we're out of time. I just want to make one last comment, which is that the question of like, well, what to do about it has come up a few times now. I do get to that at the end of the book. And I think that one thing that the history made clear to me is that we've cycled between extreme drug enthusiasm and extreme drug prohibitionism. And I don't think Americans need either of that anymore. We don't need peddling. We don't need prohibition. What I argue at the end is that we need a free relationship to drugs. We need to understand their consequences. We need safe routes of administration and safe environments to take them in. But we also need some kind of distance from the kind of stressors that compel drug use as well. And for that, the kinds of solutions don't have to do with drugs or drug policy. They have to do with basic material security in American society, jobs, healthcare, et cetera.
Great, yeah. Yeah, I just want to thank the panelists again. That was an amazing conversation, but we are almost out of time. Couple of things really quick. If you don't have the book, it's an amazing book, obviously, and Verso's offering it for 50% off. Just talk to Anthony in the front, and there's like a QR code you can use to get that promotion. And Jacobin, our current issue is on Iraq, 20 years on. If nobody has if you don't have a Jacobin subscription, just talk to me at the other table. Yeah, we don't have a ton of time left in the space because we want to be able to make sure that the People's Forum folks can get home at a reasonable hour. But I think we can continue this conversation at the bar afterwards. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming.